February 24th marks the third anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the start of a devastating war, which has taken the lives of a reported 46,000 Ukrainian soldiers and an unknown number of Russian military. Last week, senior U.S. and Russian officials met in Riyadh for peace talks without Ukraine at the table. And that move has raised deep concern among our European allies and signals a dramatic shift in U.S. foreign policy. Former U.S. Ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, joins us now to talk about what's at stake. It has been an astonishing week as the new Trump administration initiated direct peace talks with Russia, sidelining European allies and, most importantly, Ukraine itself. Then there was a series of Donald Trump's mind-boggling statements. Let's take a listen to those.
But think of it, a modestly successful comedian. President Zelensky talked the United States of America into spending $350 billion to go into a war that basically couldn't be won, that never had to start and never would have started if I was president, not even a chance. A dictator without elections. Zelensky better move fast or he's not going to have a country left. Got to move fast because that war is going in the wrong direction. In the meantime, we're successfully negotiating an end to the war with Russia, something I'll admit that only Trump is going to be able to do in the Trump administration. We're going to be able to do it.
So Donald Trump is asserting that Ukraine started the war against Russia, that Zelensky is a dictator, that he has a 4% approval rating, and that he talked the U.S. into spending $350 billion. When you heard that, Mike, what was your reaction? Was it surprising, or, considering the run-up to these negotiations, not all that surprising after all?
Honestly, my first reaction was embarrassment as an American, as a U.S. citizen, that our president, at one time, the president of the United States was also the leader of the free world, which would say such things that are just empirically false. I want to be crystal clear about this. You can have an opinion about a lot of things, but we do here at Stanford. We have opinions, we have hypotheses, but you don't get to have opinion about facts. It's 2 + 2 = 4 every day here at Stanford. And the idea, the fact that Putin invaded Ukraine is a fact. It's not an opinion. On the approval rating too, he's not at 4%. There's dozens of polls show that he has a higher approval rating than President Trump. But it's clear that Trump doesn't care about facts. He has a policy shift that he's seeking to do, where he wants to embrace the Russian dictator, the imperial Russian dictator, and he wants to throw under the bus democratically elected president, not a dictator, Zelensky. And he wants to distance us from our European allies. I'm glad you brought that up. I was just at the Munich Security Conference last week, and they were shocked by the messages, punctuated by the speech delivered by Vice President J.D. Vance. This is a monumental shift in American foreign policy. I cannot remember anything even that approximates this, where we went from being the leader of the free world with our democratic allies in NATO and other parts of the world, to now President Trump, at least personally, wants to shift to put us on the side of the autocrats. So the world is divided between autocrats and Democrats. We used to be on the sides of the Democrats. He wants to move us to the side of the autocrats.
And I guess this is a simple question, but why?
It's not a simple question. I don't know the answer to that question. People hypothesize, they talk about this, that, and the other, leverage and things like that. If I had to guess, and I really want to emphasize, I'm guessing. I think it's a real mystery that people should, and journalists and analysts should spend more time digging into. But I think there are two things. One, Trump and Putin ideologically have a lot in common. This is about ideology. Trump's a populist nationalist. Putin's a populist nationalist. Trump's against multilateral institutions. So is Putin. Putin talks about the decadent liberal West. Trump does too. I don't know if Trump believes that latter part, by the way, but he most certainly talks that way. and their deputies and their people, the MAGA world, they think and talk and interact with people around Putin. So that's the first thing. They share that I call it, illiberal nationalism, and I'm a liberal internationalist. And so that's a difference. And here's the really strange thing. Putin and Trump have more ideologically in common today, in my view, than I do with President Trump, even though we're both Americans. So that's the first thing. The second thing is Trump, he's a transactional kind of guy. He's a real estate guy. He's looking for deals. He's looking for business. He wants to open hotels in Gaza and, take over Greenland. And Putin understands that. That's the way he has been talking to him when he was president before. And even at that Saudi meeting that you mentioned earlier, where you're right, tragically, Saudis were at the table, by the way. Go look at the photos, right, by the way. Representatives of the Saudi government were there. The Ukrainians were not. But you know who was sitting on a backbench? I know all these guys. I used to be the ambassador there, right? It was the head of their sovereign wealth fund. He's a guy that wants to do deals with American companies. By the way, he has degrees from Stanford and Harvard. And that was not by accident. That is the way that Putin is appealing to Trump. And people that know Trump better than I do say those are the kinds of things that he likes to talk about.
What we're witnessing here, Mike, is a new world order, really. And what are the ramifications of a cozy relationship with Putin and other autocrats?
Well, first, maybe I'm just too much of an optimist, but I want to rephrase what you just said. We're not witnessing the creation of a new world order. We're witnessing the attempt at the creation of a new world order, because we are not a monarchy yet. We are not a dictatorship. And President Trump may want to create this new world order and cozy up to autocrats like Putin, but I don't. And I know a lot of Americans who don't. 81% of the American people do not trust Putin. On this issue, Trump is radically out of pace with the American people. I also know lots of congressmen and lots of senators, including lots of Republican congressmen and senators who disagree with the president on this issue. They're not expressing it as loudly as I would. So I think the fight is still on about whether we're going to go that way. But if we did go that way, I think it would be catastrophic for American national security interests and our prosperity. Because what we would be doing, we'd be walking away from our allies in Europe. We would be making nervous our allies in Asia. We would be tempting Xi Jinping to invade Taiwan. If America is going to take Greenland and Putin's going to take Ukraine, why can't I take Taiwan? That's how the logic goes. And he'll look at us as being weak, as being feckless, as not standing up for anything. And I don't think President Trump is going to help defend Taiwan. And I think we look weak by caving to Putin. And in this instance, I think that emboldens Xi Jinping. That is a horrific world. That is a world that undermines, let's say you don't care about democracy and human rights like I do, right? I get it. We got our problems here at home. I talk around the country all the time. I hear that. But this will hurt our security. This will hurt our financial, our ability to do business around the world. And that's why I think it's so important that we stop this now before that dangers come later.
Well, I think a lot of people, at least on my social media channels, Mike, are saying, how do we stop it? Republicans have not been speaking out. As you mentioned, there have been some sort of half-hearted attempts to say they didn't agree with President Trump or didn't like his choice of words. But how can this shift actually be stopped?
That's a hard question. I don't have an easy answer. I think doing what we're doing right now is part of that. I think we need to have a national discussion about American national interests. For too many decades, this has been just the purview of elite institutions like Stanford and, Washington think tanks. We got to stop that. We got to explain why what happens in Ukraine matters to my family in Montana. We have to connect those dots. to understand this long-term thing. And it's hard. It's like climate change because it's in the future. It's not right now, and I get
Sort of
that.
theoretical, right?
It's abstract. It seems hard to understand. But we got to do it. We got to use history, right? Go back to the 1930s when the American people were also in an isolationist mood, and the Italians invaded Ethiopia and nobody cared. Not my problem. The Japanese went into China, nobody cared. Far away, not our problem. Hitler went into Poland, we still didn't care. We still had millions of Americans saying that is not our problem. And then it became our problem when we were attacked in 1941 by the Japanese. Had we had a different strategy in the early part of the 30s, not a policy of appeasement or disengagement, we might have prevented World War II. Now that's hard. That's abstract, like you said. That's a historical analogy. But I think we have to keep having this conversation. And especially, we need more leadership from our leaders in Congress in the Republican Party. They agree with me. The vast majority agree with me. Remember, the last vote we had on aid to Ukraine, it was overwhelming majorities in both the House and the Senate for that aid. They haven't changed their mind in just 6 months. What's happened in the last 6 months is they're afraid of Trump. They're afraid of him. And I understand that. But we've got to push back, and hopefully we can slow this process down so that we can get our bearings and have a national debate about what is in the American national interest.
Mike, as you know, Zelensky met with Keith Kellogg, the special envoy to Ukraine and Russia. Do you expect this meeting might diffuse the tension between Washington and Kiev? And do you know anything about what transpired at that meeting?
Well, I hope it will. And in particular, I hope that for the sake of the bilateral relationship, it gets off of Truth Social, it gets off of Twitter or X, and it gets back to more substantive conversations about what's in our interest and their interests. Right now, in my view, the back and forth that Mr. President Trump is engaged in is not in America's national interests. And he's got better things to do, by the way, than to be the chief troll for the people in Ukraine. And I hope that with the envoy Kellogg there, he's got a big job, but I was with him in the Munich Security Conference. I heard him speak. I think he understands the problem. I think they have a dual track diplomacy underway right now, one track with the Russians, one track with the Ukrainians. It wouldn't be the way I would do it, but that train has left the station. And I hope they get into a better rhythm. And I also hope, as somebody who has some experience negotiating with the Russians, that they think a little bit more before they speak. I'm talking about the Trump administration.
And in fact, you're probably talking about Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, who said that NATO membership for Ukraine was off the table and that a return to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders was unrealistic. He subsequently walked back those comments. But since you're a seasoned diplomat, I wanted to know how you explain these kinds of egregious, unforced errors on the world stage. Just a lack of experience?
I guess that's the only way I can explain it. People that know President Trump better than I do say you're always on safe ground if you repeat what you've heard him say in private. So maybe that was part of what happened. But negotiate diplomacy 101. Or just let's talk about, art of the deal. It's right here. I'm reading the book. You don't have to be an experienced diplomat, but any business person knows you don't just give the other side everything they want at the beginning of a negotiation. You trade for things that you want. You go back and forth. And when Secretary Hegseth said those things, he just gave away two of our most important chits before the negotiation had already started. And I have negotiated with the Russians, and I can tell you they are tough negotiators. They sit at the table and don't say a thing. we Americans, we're very impatient, right? We want to get to a deal, get it done as fast as we can. As General Kellogg said, we're on Trump time here. That's what he said in Munich, right? We're eager to get a deal. But when you do that, what ends up happening when I've been in part of negotiations with the Russians is they stonewall, and then you start negotiating with yourselves. That's no good. And you especially don't negotiate in public. That is just elementary. And they call it a rookie mistake, but I hope they kind of, get back together, think about it, maybe get some coaching on kind of elementary diplomacy and do a better job in the next rounds.
Well, let's hope so. But he has zero experience in this whole area. So we'll see what happens. I'm curious as we watch this unfold, are Russian officials doing a happy dance and are our European allies running for cover? You have so much insight into the reaction to these actions. I'd love to hear from you on that.
Well, first on the Europeans, because I just got back from Munich. The whole conference, right? Remember, this is a conference of prime ministers, presidents, foreign ministers, defense ministers. It's the premier European security conference, goes back decades. And this is always about the transatlantic partnership, right? It used to be called Verkunda. And after the vice president delivered his remarks, it was just complete shock. Every European I saw, people talked about, this is the end of the transatlantic partnership.
Can I interrupt you briefly? Because I'd love you to explain what J.D. Vance said and why it was so shocking at the Munich Security Conference.
Yeah. Usually, especially at the beginning of new administrations, it is customary, actually it's customary even for the vice president, by the way, to come and give the kind of first big speech about what will be American foreign policy in the new era. I worked in the Obama administration, as you know. I worked at the White House for 3 years on the National Security Council, and I worked on Vice President Biden's speech at this very same meeting, the Munich Security Council. That was the first big statement. So that's what everybody was waiting for. What is Trump 2 going to do in the world? He didn't mention Russia. He didn't mention China, barely. I don't think he actually even once mentioned Ukraine, let alone Gaza, let alone all the other kind of international security issues. What he did instead is he gave our European allies a lecture about how their democracies are not performing. And in particularly focused on two issues, immigration and censorship, because those are two issues that his party here in the United States are focused on. And then he found some anecdotal things where there have been things that are of concern to him in various countries in Europe, various democratic countries, various allies of the United States of America. And I want to be clear, that's okay. We should be concerned about some of these things. That they canceled a presidential election in Romania, that deserves attention. But to not say anything about these other issues, to claim erroneously, in my view, that democracy in Europe is a greater threat to the continent than Russia or China, when I'm sitting in the room, literally sitting in the room with Ukrainians, they are Europeans too, that was just an outrageous speech that just missed his mark. The other things we were just talking about with Hegseth and all these kind of mixed messages, the vice president could have cleaned that all up in this speech, right? The whole continent, and most certainly the entire Munich Security Conference, was watching. He could have used it for that, and he chose not to. And then one last thing. In focusing on alleged problems with democracy in places like Great Britain and other old established liberal democracies, he never once mentioned Belarus, it's a European country, and he never once mentioned these kinds of abuses inside Russia. And that was particularly galling to me because you know who else was at this meeting? Yulia Navalny was at this meeting. The last time this group got together, I was with Yulia The night before, they killed.
Alexei Navalny's
Yeah,
widow.
the last time this Munich conference took place, she was there, and that's the day they killed her husband. Putin killed Alexei Navalny. And so for him to, and by the way, there was one other person there, Zhana Nemtsova. Putin also killed her father in 2015. They were in the audience too. And for him not to say one word about that while berating our European allies about their failures in democracy, by the way, with not mentioning how much trouble we're having with our democracy here at home, I just thought that was a really big missed opportunity.
He also met with the leader of the far right alternative for Germany, or the AfD party, which caused quite a scandal as well.
He did, for reasons that I do not understand.
And talk about that party and how frightening that party is, Mike.
Well, this is a far right party in Germany. Many German politicians will not even talk to them. They think they're the successor party to the Nazi party. I'm not an expert on that, so I'm quoting German officials who spoke at this conference I was just at. So I want to be very careful about that. But they are most certainly a far right party, extremist party that's surging in the polls in Germany, like many other populist nationalist parties throughout Europe are. There is this transnational movement going on. The MAGA movement here in the United States, there are similar kinds of movements in Germany, in France, in Italy, in the UK, Slovakia, Romania. It's happening. And so Vice President Vance was trying to get involved in that in ways that, they talk about sovereignty when it comes to America, right? America first, don't tell us what to do. Don't get involved in our internal affairs. But when it comes to Germany, somehow it's okay for Americans to get involved in their domestic politics. I think it'll have a backfiring effect, by the way. I don't think anybody was impressed by their meeting.
People gasped in the audience, I understand, and the German chancellor had a very pointed response to J.D. Vance. Tell us about that.
He did, and the defense minister did, the German defense minister did, everybody did. And I would say two things. One is the good part of it is there was a sense after this meeting, especially after the vice president's speech, that we in Europe now have to get our own act together. We're on our own. And that's good. They should have done that. That's a healthy thing. Maybe that's what the vice president had in mind by being so provocative. That's a good thing. The lamentable part is already they were saying to people like me, it's been nice knowing you. It's been nice, Mike. We've loved having you here, but we're going our separate ways. And I'm not ready to give up, by the way. This is a long game that I'm in. This is just one presidency. We have another election coming up. I'm not ready to say, okay, we're done too. But that was definitely the mood in the room.
What about the Russians, as I mentioned? Are they having celebrations and popping champagne with this very significant about face that Trump has done?
Without question. I watch Russian television, so you don't have to. And honestly, I think they are surprised by how much they have already gained in the last week of negotiations. I think they didn't expect that it would just be handed to them in the way that it does. Like I said, I've negotiated with them. You hold your hardest cards for the last play in the negotiations, right? Like I helped to negotiate the New START treaty, and you left the very last plays to the end. We did the same thing on many other negotiations, and everything was just handed to them. Honestly, I think they were surprised by that. Now, I hope that we're going to get better. This was just their first time on the field, and Lavrov's sitting there. He's been at it for 21 years. Secretary Rubio's been at it for 3 weeks. That's a big asymmetry and experience. I hope they get it right, but the first round definitely goes to the Russians.
How do you see this war in Ukraine ending, Mike? What do you expect from these negotiations?
I don't know. I do know a couple of things, however. The idea that some in the Trump administration seem to believe, and most certainly a lot of Americans believe, that Trump and Putin are going to meet in Saudi Arabia and sign a deal, and then they're just going to email it, or they'll just put it up on social media and have the Ukrainians read it, and that'll be an end of the war. That's not going to happen. That grossly underestimates Ukrainian agency. I saw many Ukrainian soldiers when I was in Munich, and I asked them what motivates them to fight. And they didn't roll out, big words like liberty and sovereignty and the European Union. They said, I'm fighting to avenge the murder of our people. And they're not going to just roll over because Mr. Trump wants them to. So they've got to think harder about that they're grossly overestimating American power when it comes to dictating the terms. And they're going to fight without weapons. It'll be harder, but they just won't roll over. Having said that, I also hear, and I have, colleagues in the Ukrainian government, that they are ready to deal, that they are willing to sacrifice things that they were not ready to do 2 years ago, because this war is atrocious and they want to end it. But they just have to get something in return. I mean, think about it. We've been at it now for a couple of weeks, the Trump administration. I've got a list. I think I'm up to 10 different concessions that Putin has received. I can't think of one concession that the Ukrainians have received.
What do you think about this meeting between Trump and Putin? Trump has said he will probably meet with him this month. It will be the first time a U.S. president has met with Putin face-to-face since 2021. What do you think this meeting could possibly accomplish?
I'm nervous about that meeting. When I was in the government, we saved the summits for the end of negotiations, not for the beginning of them. I just mentioned this New START treaty, an arms control agreement that I worked on with the Obama administration, by the way, limiting 30% of all nuclear weapons in the world. That was good for America and good for Russia. It wasn't just good for Russia. We signed that in Prague at the end of it, not in the beginning. And what I worry about, because of the things I see President Trump saying that are just not true, I worry that Putin will take advantage of that and that he will lock in some kind of commitment. And once you get a commitment from the president, and I saw this when I was in the government, it's really hard to roll those back. You can roll back things that your negotiators say. And we did it all the time. We said, well, that may be what our negotiator said, but the president's the final decider. And that's why you do it in the sequence I just talked about, right? So you can think hard about whether this is in America's national interest or not. I just don't think they're right to do that so soon. So I hope that the negotiations will need some time, and maybe they'll postpone that until there's much more substance has been agreed to by lower level officials before you put the president of the United States in the room with President Putin.
I want to conclude where we started, Mike, and this is my last question, but President Zelensky responded to President Trump's statements by saying, I would like to have more truth with the Trump team. I'm curious how world powers and nations globally deal with a U.S. president who regularly traffics in bald-faced lies. How does that affect their ability to trust America and believe in what it says?
Nobody trusts America right now. Our friends don't, and our enemies don't, by the way. President Trump said he trusts Putin. I'll tell you, I am 100% confident in saying Putin does not trust Trump. And I just think this, I'm glad you asked this question, because, we're all in our world here and we're reacting to Elon Musk and everything that's happening. And we've kind of gotten used to President Trump popping off here and there. And we're always supposed to say, follow what he does, not what he says. But to the rest of the world, they're not accustomed to being lectured to. They're not accustomed to this kind of, trolling. That's
or just being flat out lied to.
And lied to. And so that just means they won't trust us. They won't share their intelligence with us. They won't cooperate with us on cybersecurity matters, because they just won't trust us. And the president and his team loves to quote Ronald Reagan and saying, we want peace through strength. And I like that phrase too. But this is not that. This is weakness. This is weakness. And it means we will become increasingly isolated. And yes, we are the most powerful country in the world. I'm just finishing my next book called Autocrats versus Democrats, and I have the data in that book. We'll talk about it when it comes out in the fall to show that we still are. But our greatest source of power compared to our adversaries today and similar to the Cold War. This is a book comparing the Cold War to today. Has always been our allies. That's our superpower. We've had enduring, powerful, democratic allies. And if we alienate them by chastising them, berating them, saying things that aren't true about them, they will move on. And we will be alone. And America alone is much worse off than America with allies.
Ambassador Mike McFaul, always so appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.